Hi, my name is Al Nemec. I'm the Web Services Manager for the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences. I'm here today to talk to you a little about my talk for the IT Professionals Conference, and that is serverless. Specifically, trying to attain serverless without compromises. You know, the idea behind serverless has had a lot of debate around it, partly because it throws itself off due to the name. And the name, of course, serverless, doesn't make a whole lot of sense because there still is a server involved, of course. The key is just really trying to leverage a lot of our decentralized architecture we have available to us these days. The idea with microservices, for example, the way we can take our existing available cloud services and decentralize everything so that instead of having a single application where the database potentially maybe Apache or Nginx or having basically MySQL all involved on the same box or even cluster of boxes, and really spread these things out to operate in environments that they really thrive the best. So, for example, right now, a lot of campus, for example, is utilizing WordPress. WordPress is a fantastic platform. It allows everyone to feel like there's a little bit more of an open source democratization of publishing to the web. It allows those content editors, the folks that are really knowledgeable in all of their areas, to be able to put content on their websites without necessarily having to be the web developer. And it allows the web developers to really operate in a medium that helps elevate and really improve the availability of new features, dynamic information, functionality, key things that really help and aid the mission of that website and what it's trying to do. So what I'm here to talk to you today about specifically is how we're going to kind of take all this idea, this thought of serverless, and put it into a practical example. And on top of that, how do we take that information and really position this in such a way that showcases that you can have the serverless without sort of the downsides that go with it necessarily. So today, let's dig in a little bit here. What I've got for you today is I want to showcase a demonstration of, in this case, utilizing a front-end client-side JavaScript framework, in this case, Vue JS. The idea of serverless doesn't demand that you use a framework. You don't have to use React or Vue or Angular or anything else of that nature. You can just do plain HTML and CSS, right? Serverless really is the idea of taking the front end of your website, that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, those core three, and letting them live, because they are in many ways stateless, letting them live on the edge nodes of multiple servers. So if you think of your CDN, your content delivery network, you allow the content that can live there to live there, right? Typically people think of a CDN with their images and their video, but you could also put the HTML and CSS and JavaScript, assuming it doesn't need to change rapidly or dynamically, in that same place. And what that allows you to do is to not only be immediately scalable and incredibly fast, but it enables this distribution of your content in a way that ensures its availability, that ensures uptime far beyond what you would get even if you are trying to do multiple nodes on, let's say, a cluster of EC2s on AWS, or potentially even a mixture of different nodes that are all controlling the same content just on campus. You're getting worldwide coverage of your website content, and that is something that's really hard to beat. So how do we do this, right? So in many ways, when you're looking at your serverless architecture, you're talking about utilizing some sort of additional existing cloud platform. AWS is a great option to use, but every cloud platform provider has options in this way. You could use GCP, you could use with Google, you could use a number of different places to do this. You could use something even such as like Netlify. So for those who are potentially familiar with Netlify, it's a fantastic platform for really diving into maybe your first steps into doing this. So if you kind of come away with this talk and thinking, oh, I'm going to check that out, check out Netlify at least. From an outside standpoint, it's a fantastic way to get the idea going. You can start just by putting up an index.html file, kind of get your first steps in this, and it's a wonderful way to do this. So kind of when you look at how this is going to work, where the site lives is just a key benefit of serverless, but you need to develop something to put up there. And obviously, if you develop just a flat HTML file or flat HTML with CSS and JavaScript, that's great. I mean, it's going to be fast, right? There's nothing to process. It just immediately is there, present, and shows up on everyone's screen right away. So when it comes to mobile devices, when it comes to serving up, content, it should be immediate and fast, and that's something it just can't beat. But for a lot of folks, that doesn't address sort of the core problem we have with the web in the past, which is what things like WordPress have solved, which is that ability to publish content in a manner that doesn't rely on digging into the HTML. So how do we address this? Well, the idea is that we can take advantage of things like Vue JS or React.js for this matter, which kind of puts all the power on the client side of the platform, and then take the content that those can take in, which can take in from multiple areas, right? Effectively, anything that you can get a data API for, you can take in the content for. And then from that point, have that generate your flat HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Put that on your edge nodes, and that gives you the fastest of best of both worlds. So let me give you an example of how this might work. So here on the left, I've got my Vue JS application, kind of basic and simple. I have it right now. You see, a few basic items here, maybe some content. Some of this can live within an application. Maybe there's a form, and maybe there's some content coming from WordPress, right? So what's going on here is that on the right-hand side, this is my Vue JS application, and this is an entirely client-side application, right? So in order to get this up and running, I happen to use, and one of my favorite ways to start up a Vue JS app is using something called Nuxt. Nuxt is a wonderful platform for doing such a thing because it kind of gives you sort of great first starters for Vue. If you're using something like React, I highly suggest Gatsby. Gatsby is fantastic for doing this sort of thing. So again, there are great options in multiple ways, but this is just kind of what I'm demoing today. So if you take a look at what's going on here in this application on the right, you really kind of start to get a gist of kind of the new component architecture that a lot of these front-end JavaScript frameworks are trying to accomplish. If you look at these folders, you kind of start to get the gist, right? You have your static assets, you have components, things like maybe my footer, my header, maybe blog items, that sort of thing. We'll go over those in a moment. My core layout, the layout that affects the main page. And I can have more than one layout. In this case, I just have the one layout in this particular application. You can get into things like middleware, which we'll talk about in a moment and what that's kind of used for. In this case, one thing I do like about Nuxt is that it simplifies the router, right? One of the things that you can take advantage of with these front-end client-side frameworks is instead of the routing living on your server side, and therefore every time someone changes web pages, they have to request a new URL from, they're requesting a URL from the server's going out and then basically assembling the HTML and shipping it back to the user, and then the user's browser's reloading that new URL, hopefully, of course, caching any static as it had from the page before, but sort of getting that, that wipe and then painting the page. Instead, you could let all that routing happen client side, thanks to the advantages of things like your HTML5 advantages in history and backing, things of that nature. So what happens here is that I can set up multiple pages. Those can be dynamic or they can be static, and that content can then live there. So you get immediate navigation changes, just instantaneous, right? No waiting for the server to come back, just immediate feedback, which is fantastic from a user experience. You have additional options in here that get into things like, if you're in Google Analytics, we can talk about that another time. Things like static assets, again, favicon, maybe a few pieces of JavaScript that don't live inside your application. And then lastly, the store. Now, the store is kind of key here in this case. In this particular application, I'm using something called Vuex, which is exactly like using something like Redux in React. In many ways, this is one way to handle your data. There's, not one great option over the other. You can use this. Some people really get into using something like GraphQL. Using something with Apollo on your application that talks to a GraphQL source can be a fantastic way to handle data. So perhaps another talk, another time for that, but that's, again, another way you can kind of go in this avenue. The last thing I want to cover here is that you also have something in your Nuxt application, if you're running one of these, that's called your Nuxt config. And it's similar to the config files you're going to get in any other front-end framework application. But in this case, this is going to offer us a couple of key areas that we're going to want to talk about. So all in all, if I show you what this application is, before we do anything else, we can start up our application really simply by running npm run dev. Now doing this spins up the local web server. It's on localhost 3000. And if I hop on over to that right here, and I'll actually refresh so you can see it actually building, you can see this kind of puts together all the modules. And here we are. All right, so one of the things you're going to note here is that you see kind of this application as I showed you before, and you've got these 3 pages. If you kind of go into our pages section here in the application, we're going to see that there is, for example, an academics page. This /academic slug you see up here, this is available here, and you can see this content very much one-to-one, right? You can do this in your application. You can just have static content, and that's fine. It's just one way you can kind of build things out. But this just kind of put it back in the old standard situation you've had before, where you had to still edit HTML to change your content. There are other ways to handle this though too. So for example, this home page, right? If we go back to the root page, this content, this hello world, as you see here, is coming from WordPress, right? So anyway, we have our WordPress data source in this case, right, for this home page. How is that working? Well, if I go over here, I have a WordPress instance I've set up for the purposes of this demo, but your WordPress instance could live anywhere. That's one of the beauties of serverless is the actual information for this entire instance, this website you're running, could have a WordPress instance that's living elsewhere for that matter, because data sources are basically all treated equally within this client-side application. I could have a mix of data sources. I could have a WordPress, a Drupal, maybe 2 WordPress instances, maybe something else entirely. But the idea is that you can take in these data sources and then display them in what you will in your application. So in this case, I have this sample post, right? If I go over to my WordPress instance, there's my sample post. I can go into this sample post instance here. I can take a look. I can see what I've got here, and I can see that if I expand this just due to the screen sizes, for example, there's that featured image I'd set. So from a content editor's perspective, this is fantastic, right? Because you can still come in here and manage your site content in the way that content editor is used to doing. You don't have to ask them to change what they're doing. They still get a nice interface to see what they're doing. And if they want to make a new post, let's say like this, let's say sample second post. And I'll just put some sample content here. And let's go ahead and also set a featured image. So I'm going to go and add to this document a featured image. And gosh, what did we choose? We had an aerial photo. Let's go ahead and choose this one here. And we'll just go ahead and say we want to make this visible. We'll publish. All right. So now we have 2 posts. If I go back over here and I refresh the page, we're going to find that this second post is present. And one of the nice things about this is that with these 2 posts and everything is that we can actually showcase this content here. And again, it just can work just like the person's used to. But in this case, the front end, instead of being in PHP inside that same WordPress instance where the database lives, where the server's residing, this front end can live on every edge node basically around the world. And that gives you that scalability. And at the same time, you have some greater options as well that you can really play with here. So for example, let's say we've got our sample post. Let's click on this first one here, right? Here's my sample post. There's my title, my content, featured image up here in the header. Likewise, I can go ahead and look at the second post here, right? I can go over to the academics page, which we saw was a static page. So now we have this mix of static pages and dynamic pages. And in this application context, because of the nature of state and the way it's managed in these modern frameworks, everything is sort of decoupled in a way that allows you to have that flexibility. Someone can come in here and change the mode, jump into a post, change the mode back, go over to academics, and everything just kind of keeps working. There's no sort of difficulty in that handoff of JavaScript data from one page to the next that you normally have to grapple with when you're dealing with a normal completely server-side static rendered application. So in this case, we've got this post, but for the most part, what you're seeing here could and very well, in fact, is right now because of development purposes, sort of being served like an SPA or a single page application. So single page applications, notably are powerful in the way that they can do things in the UI. They're fantastic in the sense of what they've brought to the web and things like applications. People that think of things like Google Docs, Gmail, anything that basically lets you interact with the page in a much more dynamic way instead of just sort of viewing document to document, the sort of traditional web way. However, SPAs have some downsides. So with an SPA, you're often left with that the server side is completely sort of handing off all of the view, right? Okay, so with an SPA, if we were to go in and let's say have this up on a server and just serving this as an SPA, that one of the downsides is that if serving it from these edge nodes is that you wouldn't get any of that rendering from the server, which has a lot of problems. One is that it can be slower on old devices that have to then sort of compile all that JavaScript with JIT and then dump that on the DOM. You also have a problem where actually getting through this basically showing this information and having it properly parsed by any search engine is usually going to get put farther back in the queue. Google, in fact, famously had an announcement not too long ago that they talked about how anything that went through being purely JavaScript served doesn't get parsed as quickly or as readily. So there's also some valid concerns, I think, over accessibility and how that would work. So it's really to the benefit of the user and even of the application itself. It'll be served quicker if instead of there being this sort of just empty DOM with a single div, instead is actually being served as a normally statically generated piece of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that if you hit the page without JavaScript enabled, you would still see this page. You'd see it exactly as you see here. And in fact, without JavaScript, clicking this link would quite simply just take you to the next page, and as a traditional website would, right? Just reload the page, show the next piece of content. You wouldn't get these animations in between states as you can get with something like a single page application, but you would still see the content, and that's fantastic. You don't want it to be inaccessible. So how does that work, right? So in general, this is something that especially frameworks like Gatsby on the React side of things and like doing things here in Next, as I'll show you in a minute, have made much more possible. And it really kind of reduces one of the biggest trade-offs of going with sort of this serverless microservice infrastructure architecture stuff. So I love all the buzzwords, right? So in general, if we look at our Nuxt config.js in this particular Vue JS application, there's a number of things that are in here. One of which is you're going to see a lot of the base situational sort of what is the set of this application? What does the head have in it, right? The mode, right? And this mode, for example, in Vue is kind of important because that can be an SPA, but I've set it to universal, which means that it'll use the best of both worlds. It'll take on server-side rendering if it's available, if we've set it up that way. It'll leverage this pre-generate command to serve static HTML, and when static HTML is not available, we can have it fall back to then display things as an SPA. So we can kind of get that mix of dynamic data and pre-rendered content data. So in this case, if I go down here a little bit more, we're going to see a bunch of the configuration, and the key one here is generate. Now, what generate means is that this basically has a specific NPM script that we'll set up such that anytime we deploy this particular application, or we set up a webhook such that WordPress, when you hit publish or update, will also kick off this same NPM script on your CI/CD of choice. What it'll do is it'll go out to your data source, in this case our dynamic source, this WordPress endpoint, and it will actually grab the post data that we want. So we can tell it to grab the post data and store that, and as it does so, we'll actually also return and store to basically our output file, our static file, all of those pages already generated with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then what will happen is as the user visits any one of those URLs, any entry point they have, they'll be served from the server flat CSS, HTML, and JavaScript. And then the moment the JavaScript arrives, assuming that's not disabled, it'll hydrate, as they say, which is basically taking on the sort of role of what the SPA would then do from then forward, which is then take on the routing. Basically, it's controller and view operations, right? Take on routing and display of all the other pages and operations. So this is kind of how we solve that situational problem of how do we get our server on all these edge nodes served quickly from those sources and in a way that is really functional for everyone, regardless of platform or data speed or anything of that nature. So in this case, that's kind of where things go. So in fact, what we would have do here is if we can imagine this is our CI/CD, that platform here, whether it be Netlify or AWS, would run npm run generate, as you can see here. And this would go through and look at the data source and build up all the static files for us. And then from there, we can deploy that out, and that content would be visible immediately. So this is kind of where we get that particular standing. There we go. See, generated academics, generated thank you, generated contact. Going through the endpoints. Look at that, generating blog sample second post, right? These slugs that came out of WordPress. If we go back and change the WordPress slug and we kick off that webhook, this command will run again and regenerate a new piece of HTML with the proper slug. So this is kind of what we're looking for. So in essence, what you get here is that you've got a WordPress instance for handling your blog. You could have other data sources as well. You can have content that's living right within the application if you so choose. All of it sort of working together in one single application, nothing getting pulled in via embeds or iframes, and all of it being served fast from edge nodes all around the world. So this is, to me, the future of the way this goes. I think the one downside you have to keep in mind is that because there is a build step, and as you saw, that build step, for example, my machine took a number of seconds. Depending on how large your site is, that can have more or less, a bigger or smaller impact. And depending on how big your site is, that can have a pretty significant impact. And what that means is that it could take up to several minutes to actually display that information, or to get that information deployed out. That usually isn't a big deal to most of us. I think what's important here is talking with your content editors and having them recognize that when they publish content that it's not there right away, right? That's sort of a key thing to do there. But what if there was a way we could solve that as well, right? So in this case, what we're talking about is this fallback. Now, one of the things that Vue does that I love a lot is that it kind of lets you get a little bit more control over when and how it's going to use that static HTML content and when it's going to just work in SPA mode. And what we can do here is we can actually give a fallback such that when someone hits a URL that does have a valid REST endpoint, maybe from WordPress, but we don't have a pre-generated piece of HTML for, it'll say, oh, that's fine. I'll just use this template specified here, and that can still go out and do the same data retrieval and bring back the content asynchronously and display it right off the bat. So effectively, people that are going out there to see the content before the build step is even completed will still get the content, with maybe a minute or two lapse in between it being that SPA mode to now going back to being a fully server-side generated piece of HTML. All right, so what else can we do with this client-side application? Why are we going to all this trouble to go connect to WordPress via JSON API and pull back this content in another form and then have to redisplay it out on our own and our own components? Well, a lot of it's to really try to showcase the greater level of control and the things you can accomplish in the user experience for this sort of thing. I think there is always that trade-off, no matter which way you tend to go, where if you want to something that is sort of just WordPress friendly out of the box, doesn't demand any amount of attention whatsoever, but you're willing to forego a little bit of some of the other controllable things you could do, a WordPress theme by itself works fantastic. It's what WordPress is built for. This is really letting you take it to the next level, though, and take that content and display it out in another fashion. So what I'd recommend is if you take a look at doing something like this and you leverage something like Vue or React or Ember or in another framework or whatever you so choose, look at what you're really doing it for and what you can accomplish. Sometimes it's because you do have multiple data sources you want to bring in into sort of this application all at once, right? If you took a standard WordPress application, the only data source that's sort of considered at first party, of course, is WordPress data. Anything else has to come outside of that secondarily, either ingested to the database, WordPress database, and you're doing SQL queries manually, or perhaps you're just doing those as JSON, just JavaScript asynchronous calls on the fly, but it doesn't get to live within the content of the site, it doesn't stay with the state. These are all things that you kind of have to decide as you go. One of the things that I really particularly enjoy is the fact that you do get to have things like, animated routes, things of that nature. Where you get to have these immediate feedback too, where you get mobile responsiveness that doesn't really have sort of a boundaries to how fast you can work with the content. So to do something like this, for example, in our particular Vue applications, we're doing animations. If we take a look down here, we've got all of our pages. We've got academics, contact Vue. You can see there's this transition between them. That's all well and good. But how is this all being accomplished? Well, what we have here is some middleware. And in our middleware, we're actually committing a store change of current page, update page. And in this particular store, if you go down to our Vuex store, you can see current page here. And if we look at update page, it's changing the state name of the page here, page equals index. Anytime this page index state changes, actually in our layout, we're actually able to animate that change. And so we can do all kinds of things with how this would work. So in general, see, for example, page, we're returning this current store page here. This is something that we can then do transitions and crossfades and you name it. And it's a really fantastic and powerful tool to really kind of bring a greater experience to the website. All right, so what do we have here now, right? We have this application where we have Vue showing these blog posts in here. How does this look like on the application side? Well, we have a Vue component that we've built. We have a blog component that we've built. And that blog component, if you look at it here in Vue, has the three typical structures of a Vue component, which is its template, or its markup. This is equivalent to sort of the JSX return render function, if you will, if in React. You have your script section right here. Anything that's effectively in that space is talking about anything dynamic or the data related to that component. And of course, the style tags, which lets you do all kinds of things using standard CSS, Sass, less, stylus, things that various people have different preferences on, other than myself. You can even scope the style specifically to this component, so the styles as you make them will only be affecting this component and where it's used. But up here in the actual section of this, as we can see that we're just basically getting back a computed property from our data. So, let me back up. Okay. So in this case, it's getting posts, right? It's getting posts for this data, and effectively what's going on here is if we can see it's going to the store, it's going out and it's grabbing get posts. Well, what exactly does that mean, right? Well, if you go out here to get posts, where it's talking about that getter, get posts is basically this current set of state of posts, this array that we want to dump back out. What happens here is that when the actual application starts up, when it's first doing it, it's making that first initial API call to WordPress, and it's saying with JavaScript and saying, hey, give me the top set of posts you have. And we can decide in our application like how many posts we want to grab. Top 100, top 50. Funny enough, grabbing most posts, because you're not grabbing the images or video or any of the heavy assets, is usually pretty lightweight, but you really don't want to say just grab everything. You're going to want to figure out what the sort of best practice is there for best performance and time, and load on your own server. So once you do this sort of call, you have this data in state. And then from there, we can manipulate that state and dump it back out. In this case, we're just going to give the raw state as we get it from WordPress, that REST API, back to the component, right? And the component up here is taking that information. So in fact, what it's doing here is it's saying, for example, well, I'm going to display this thumbnail here on the left. Okay, well, we're just going to take a look here and say, if there is a post-embedded WordPress featured media, great. Then let's grab the medium size image, source URL, and dump that into an image that sits here on the left. And then right after that, we're going to grab title and excerpt, right? And that's how we display these here. And that's basically it. Now, if we click on a post in our application, right, we go off and see more. Where's that living, right? The idea is that this blog component is just for displaying sort of a list of posts. Down here in our actual set of pages, we have you'll see the slug is blog sample second post as we have it here. If I go to blog _ slug, the underscore is denoting that dynamic slug information. So the slug, it's going to take on anything that's under that /blog path. So in this case, this is our single component for every blog post. And again, we're once again grabbing via data this post property, which is basically doing the same thing it was doing before, only this time instead of grabbing a bunch of posts, it's just going to grab the single post, the post that it's trying to display. And when it gets that data back, it's going to dump into the template at the top, including a couple of things like SVG icons and things that I've added to the page. But for the most part, it's pretty basic, right? It's just the title and the content, vpost content rendered. So in this case, this is kind of a really simple component, and it's dumping out this here. And because Vue is handling the routing for us and the animations for us, jumping back and forth between posts is as simple as can be, and it doesn't really need us to do anything else for it. So this is one of the beauties of using something like some of these frameworks. So if you take a look here, this is just a really great simple example. If you try to get complicated with things, if you want to add in things like advanced custom fields, you can do that, right? All you really have to do is have WordPress output your advanced custom fields to your REST API. So there are great plugins out there like the ACF to REST API, which will do that sort of thing. It'll let you output that data straight to your JSON feed coming out of your WordPress site, and there you go. All right, so you can see like we have this generate command. We're going out and getting our content, but how are we getting this content from WordPress exactly? Well, we're hitting the WordPress REST API. If I go out to the WordPress REST API, or I hit the endpoint of my particular WordPress instance here, you're seeing this is what I get back. I get a direct JSON feed of that content. Anything I can do a get from is effectively any content that's available without login. If you want to get retrieve content that requires a login to WordPress, that's a second part of the REST authentication that we'll have to tackle. But for the most part, a lot of content you're going to output to a theme is the same stuff you could get without authentication, of course. So looking through here, you get all the data we need. We get the post data, we get the author ID, we get whether it's published, we get when it was published, we get things like the feature media. So this is how we get our data, and we bring that into Vue, and that's how we display out this content. So tell me what you thought. I hope that this has been interesting and useful. Maybe it's inspired you to try messing with this stuff later, taking a look at it. I think there's some incredibly amazing user experiences you can produce with something like this. This is something that I would encourage everyone to take a look at and see if it's the right fit for you. So with that, if you have any questions, thoughts, let me know. I'll be available on Slack during the Anti-Professionals Conference, and I hope to talk to you more then. Thanks.